Mr. President, when Congress unanimously passed the bipartisan William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act back in 2008 to strengthen federal trafficking laws and ensure that unaccompanied and undocumented children receive humane treatment, it was welcomed by the Bush administration as a priority issue in preventing the trafficking of persons around the world. At the time, Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission President Richard Land said that the legislation, quote, shows a broad coalition all the way from the left to the right and in between when it comes to significant human rights issues, unquote. The law itself was named for William Wilberforce, an evangelical Christian who led the effort in Britain's parliament to end the slave trade in Britain in the 19th century. But now, 6 years later, too many of my Republican colleagues are calling to roll back the very protections that just a few years ago were rightfully lauded as a tremendous victory for human rights. Many of us believe that the current Central American refugee crisis requires an immediate and compassionate response. Yet the proposals put forth by Senate Republicans have been to reverse critical child refugee protections and deport dreamers who have absolutely nothing to do with this current crisis. The proposal introduced by my colleague from Texas, Senator Cornyn, and similar proposals from my Republican colleagues would weaken the 2008 trafficking law and implement expedited deportation that denies children the chance to go through an orderly process to determine if they need protection. And it applies to all unaccompanied children who cross the border. I believe, Mr. President, that we are a better nation than that. Now, my Republican colleagues keep saying that they want a humane process, but these proposals would trade the safety of children for expediency and eliminate the very protections unanimously set forth by Congress back in 2008. As a father, I have to say I believe this debate can't just be about the efficiency with which we can deport refugees. It should take into account the situation that these boys and girls are seeking to escape in the first place. Both the United Nations High Commission on Refugees and the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services, in two separate reviews, recently found that approximately 60% of unaccompanied children from Central America suffered or faced harms that indicated a potential or actual need for international protection. To understand just how these proposals could adversely harm the children involved, one can read a recent article in the New York Times by Julia Preston. It tells the story of Andrea, a young woman from Honduras who was forced by her own family, associates with the Mexican drug cartel, into prostitution at age 13, if you can imagine that, Mr. President. After 2 years, she ran away, hoping to seek safety in the United States. She tried twice to flee abuse, crossing the Rio Grande, and was apprehended by Border Patrol in both attempts. When agents questioned her, Andrea did not tell them why she fled. She said, "I was just trying to protect myself, just afraid of everything after all those things those guys had been doing to my body." Andrea, a victim of sex trafficking, was sent back into harm's way to live with relatives in Mexico. Andrea is not alone. Many more children could also be sent back into a dangerous environment if proposals to overturn the 2008 Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act are passed. Unaccompanied children, like Andrea, need a safe place to talk about violence and abuse. A Border Patrol station holding cell is no place for an interview that literally will impact the rest of their lives, especially while they're still recovering from a dangerous journey. Subjecting Central American children to this screening process would be a retreat from our nation's commitment as a humanitarian leader and frankly undercuts our American values of putting children ahead of politics. a coalition of more than 100 non-governmental organizations, such as First Focus, Women's Refugee Commission, and the American Immigration Lawyers Association, all wrote a letter to President Obama earlier this month. To share their thoughts on this humanitarian crisis, they wrote, "Congress gave consideration to the unique circumstances of children when it enacted the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. Undermining due process and protection under the law is not the right answer, and certainly will not appease the criticisms of those who've been calling for more punitive and aggressive enforcement." And just yesterday, Mr. President, in an open letter to Congress, the Evangelical Immigration Table warned against weakening the protections afforded by the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, stating that, quote, "The law ensures that victims of trafficking are not only identified and screened properly, but that traffickers are penalized and brought to justice," end quote. I've also heard from the Southern Baptist Convention, the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, anti-trafficking groups, and children's lawyers who have all sent the same message to us. Don't weaken this anti-trafficking law. Congress should focus on strengthening safeguards for children rather than weakening their protections. Last week, Mr. President, one of my colleagues from Texas proposed that the only way to stop the rise of unaccompanied children is to punish dreamers and introduce legislation to defund the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Program, or DACA as it's called. DACA has helped more than 550,000 undocumented students across the country who came to the U.S. as children to have an opportunity to pursue a higher education. Dreamers in the DACA program are not the cause of the current Central American refugee crisis, and the notion that any legislation to address this issue must also end DACA is frankly out of touch. Dreamers are bright, they're hardworking, and most of them don't know how to be anything but an American. I've met many dreamers from New Mexico. I've heard their stories, I've read their letters. They have never given up on this country. And frankly, Mr. President, I'm not giving up on them. Last year, I had the pleasure of meeting a young woman named Laura in Las Cruces, New Mexico. She arrived in the United States from Mexico when she was 7 years old. She learned English. She earned good grades in school. And it wasn't actually until she was 13 years old that she even found out that she was undocumented. She said, "I couldn't believe it. All my dreams, all my hard work, it felt like it was all for nothing. Don't leave anyone behind on the American dream," she said. Laura wants to be a doctor. And there's a story from a young woman named Yuri. Her family immigrated to the United States from Mexico when she was 2 years old, back in 1996. While in high school in Albuquerque, Yuri volunteered in her community, graduated in the top 10% of her class. She even received the 2013 National Sandia Laboratory Scholarship. Recently, she was approved for DACA and is currently a student at the University of New Mexico. There are literally countless stories like these from young people who love this country and have only known it as their home. And we are not going to let Republicans use this current humanitarian crisis as an opportunity to punish dreamers. I am happy, Mr. President, to end President Obama's Deferred Action Program, but we will do that by passing the DREAM Act as part of comprehensive immigration reform. If you really want to help solve this crisis and make our policies crystal clear, all the more reason to pass the Senate's bipartisan, comprehensive immigration reform bill. The reality is our nation is facing a refugee crisis at our southern border. Children from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala have fled to the U.S. and to other neighboring Central American countries to escape unimaginable violence, corruption, extreme poverty, and instability in their home countries. In some cases, these children are literally fleeing for their lives. and many of these children are turning themselves in to Border Patrol agents. This little boy's name is Alejandro. He's 8 years old. He traveled alone from Honduras with nothing but his birth certificate in his pocket. I thought about that. I can't imagine my 7-year-old traveling across Washington, D.C. or Albuquerque, New Mexico, or any major metropolitan city in the United States by himself. It took him 3 weeks to make that dangerous journey from Central America to the banks of the Rio Grande. After being asked where his parents were, Alejandro said they were in San Antonio. He came to the United States because he wanted to reunite with his family. He didn't run, he didn't hide. When the agent approached him, Alejandro wanted to turn himself in, just like many mothers and children have done in the course of the last year. Yet, we've heard this week calls from some who would militarize our border and send in the National Guard. Now, we may, and I would say we need more resources to our Border Patrol agents. They have been taxed. They have certainly been putting in long hours since these numbers started to crest. But I don't think sending soldiers to meet people like Alejandro is the right solution to this crisis. The notion that lax border policies are somehow responsible for this latest crisis is not just a myth, it's a willful misrepresentation driven by politicians who would rather create a political issue than solve a real problem. You know, there was a recent interview when asked to discuss whether sending in the National Guard would be an appropriate response to these problems. At the core of the current crisis, Stephen Blum, who was the former chief of the National Guard Bureau under President George W. Bush, Mr. Blum told the Washington Post, quote, "There may be many other organizations that might be more appropriately called upon. If you're talking about search and rescue, maintaining the rule of law, or restoring conditions back to normal after a natural disaster or a catastrophe, the Guard is superbly suited to do that. I'm not so sure that what we're dealing with in scope and causation right now would make it the ideal choice." It's a very polite statement, Mr. President. The fact is, there are more Border Patrol agents today, more technology and resources at the border than any time in our nation's entire history. And our Border Patrol are better prepared to deal with this issue than the National Guard. Border Patrol apprehensions are today less than 1/3 of what they were at their peak. And this is because we've worked so hard and so effectively to secure the border. Those of us who represent border communities understand the challenges that we face. But there are solutions before us that are pragmatic and bipartisan, that uphold our American values, that don't compromise them. Republican leaders should demand that their colleagues in the House of Representatives act to fix our broken immigration system. The Senate passed a bipartisan bill more than a year ago now, and passing that bill would make our immigration policies crystal clear to the world. Additionally, passing the Senate's supplemental funding bill to address this crisis sends a clear signal that we are aggressively stemming the flow of children and families from Central America while continuing to treat those refugee children humanely and under the law. This situation is an emergency, and we frankly need emergency funding. Passing the emergency supplemental would allow the Departments of Homeland Security and Justice to deploy additional enforcement resources, including immigration judges, Immigration and Customs Enforcement attorneys, asylum officers, as well as expanded use of the Alternatives to Detention program. We're not arguing that every child should stay. Many, in fact, will be returned. But it will be after a Department of Justice judge has evaluated his or her case for asylum. The supplemental would also help governments in Central America better control their borders and address the root causes of migration, including criminal gangs causing and profiting from this refugee crisis. A number of us today, Mr. President, met with the ambassadors from Honduras and Guatemala, El Salvador, and it was very clear what was driving these issues. And without getting to those root causes, we won't be able to solve this crisis permanently. The supplemental would provide much-needed resources for U.S. Health and Human Services to ensure that these children receive medical screening, housing, counseling. Yet instead of supporting this funding, which seeks to meet this challenge head-on and protects these children, Republicans want to use the crisis to eliminate crucial child protections, punish some of our nation's brightest students, and promote their border enforcement-only agenda. Now, before I close and hand the floor off to some of my colleagues, I'd like to highlight some of the humanitarian work that's being done in my home state of New Mexico to address this crisis by telling the story of Project Oak Tree volunteer Orlando Antonio Jimenez. Project Oak Tree is a short-term stay shelter for Central American undocumented immigrants in Las Cruces, run by the Catholic Diocese of Las Cruces. The shelter opened earlier this month after DHS established a temporary facility for undocumented parents and their children at FLETC, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center campus in Artesia, New Mexico. Orlando signed up to volunteer for Project Oak Tree on day one. He said he saw the immediate need to assist families facing this humanitarian crisis, and he didn't think twice. He said his Christian values and belief in doing the right thing drove him to volunteer. Orlando gets the opportunity to speak to almost every single person that arrives at Project Oak Tree, and said almost all of the stories that he hears from mothers have some element of fear for their safety if they were to go back home. Orlando said that he'll never again say the words, "I'm starving," when he's just hungry, because he knows now what starving really means. He says this experience has changed his life forever, and that he'll continue to help as much as he can. I'm grateful for Orlando's work in our community and for the many, many others in New Mexico who have stepped up and shown compassion and done all they can to help. Mr. President, now it's Congress's turn to help. It's our turn to be part of the solution to this refugee crisis. Thank you, Mr. President.